Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today we're diving into a book that's notorious for its density, but also incredibly influential. Ludwig Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus.
Oh, it's a challenging read for sure. But I think anyone who's ever wondered about the nature of reality, the power of language, or the limits of what we can know, will find something thought-provoking in its pages.
Okay, so before we get lost in the Tractatus labyrinth, can you give us a roadmap? What are the big ideas we should be looking out for?
Well, Wittgenstein's main goal in the Tractatus is to draw a clear line between what can be said meaningfully and what can't. He argues that language works by picturing the world, and that pictures can only represent facts with the same logical structure. Anything that falls outside of this logical structure, ethics, aesthetics, even the meaning of life itself, belongs to the realm of the mystical, which lies beyond the limits of language.
So it's like he's trying to define the boundaries of language and show us what lies beyond those boundaries.
Exactly. And in doing so, he ends up touching on some pretty profound questions about logic, mathematics, and the nature of reality itself. It's all connected.
All right, ready to dive in. Let's start at the beginning. Proposition 1. The world is everything that is the case. It seems simple enough, but I have a feeling there's more to it than meets the eye.
You're right about that. Wittgenstein quickly clarifies that he's not talking about the world as a collection of things, but rather as a totality of facts. He's making a distinction between simply naming objects and describing the relationships between them.
So instead of saying there's a tree and there's a house, we should be talking about how the tree is next to the house, or taller than the house. Those are the facts that make up the world.
Precisely. And to understand how these facts work, Wittgenstein introduces the concept of atomic facts. Think of these as the most basic building blocks of reality, the irreducible facts that can't be broken down any further.
Okay, so atomic facts are like the individual Lego pieces that make up a larger structure.
A perfect analogy. And just like you can combine Lego pieces in countless ways to create different structures, atomic facts combine to form the complex reality we experience.
Now I'm starting to see how this connects to language. Are you saying that our sentences are like blueprints for these atomic facts?
You're getting warm. Wittgenstein's second proposition states that what is the case of fact is the existence of atomic facts. This means that every meaningful sentence ultimately corresponds to some combination of these fundamental building blocks of reality. And this brings us to his famous picture theory of language.
All right, the picture theory. This is where things start to get really interesting.
Wittgenstein argues that language works by creating pictures of facts in the world. These pictures aren't literal images, of course, but rather logical representations. He's saying that the structure of a sentence should mirror the structure of the fact it's describing.
So the arrangement of words in a sentence should correspond to the arrangement of objects and relationships in the world.
Precisely. And just like a picture can be a true or false representation of what it depicts, a sentence can be true or false, depending on whether it accurately represents a state of affairs in the world.
I'm starting to get the idea. But how does this actually work in practice? Can you give me a real-world example?
Sure. Let's say you have a sentence like, the cat is on the mat. This sentence represents a fact in the world. There's a cat, there's a mat, and the cat is located on top of the mat. The structure of the sentence mirrors the structure of the fact. If the cat is actually under the mat, then the sentence is a false picture of reality.
That makes sense. So for a sentence to be meaningful, it has to have the same logical form as the fact it's trying to represent.
Exactly. And this is where Wittgenstein starts to draw some pretty bold lines. He argues that anything that doesn't have a corresponding fact in the world can't be meaningfully expressed in language.
So what kind of things fall into this category? What can't we talk about, according to Wittgenstein?
Well, one example he gives is the structure of logic itself. Logic isn't something that exists in the world. It's the framework that allows us to think about the world. He also points to ethics and aesthetics, questions of good and evil, beauty and ugliness. These concepts can't be pictured in the same way that a cat sitting on a mat can be pictured.
That's a pretty radical idea. So are we supposed to just never talk about those things?
Not necessarily, but we have to be aware that when we do, we're no longer using language in the way that Wittgenstein thinks is logically proper. We're moving into a different realm of discourse, where words don't have the same kind of direct connection to reality.
This is starting to feel very mind-bending. But before we spiral too far down the rabbit hole, can you give us a preview of where we're headed next?
Sure. As we continue to explore the Tractatus, we'll delve deeper into Wittgenstein's views on logic and mathematics, his intriguing take on solipsism, and the role of the mystical in a world defined by facts and language. It's going to be a wild ride.
All right, I'm definitely feeling the mind-bending effect of the Tractatus. It's fascinating how Wittgenstein uses his picture theory of language to analyze everything from logic to ethics.
That's the brilliance of the Tractatus. It weaves together these seemingly separate domains through its focus on language.
Let's dig into that a bit further. We touched on logic earlier, but I'm still curious to hear more about how Wittgenstein sees logic and math fitting into this picture.
He dedicates a significant portion of the Tractatus to this very topic, arguing that logic and math are not about the world itself, but about the way we represent the world through language.
Okay, but how can math, with all its numbers and equations, be about language? It seems like math is describing objective truths about reality, not just playing with symbols.
That's a natural assumption, but Wittgenstein challenges it head-on. He claims that mathematical propositions are actually equations, and therefore pseudo-propositions. They don't express thoughts about the world in the same way that sentences do.
So a mathematical equation like 2 + 2 = 4 isn't a statement about the existence of four things?
Exactly. It's more like a rule for manipulating symbols. He compares it to a game, where we move pieces according to certain rules. Math doesn't tell us about the world. It provides a framework for making calculations within a system.
So for Wittgenstein, both logic and math are more like grammar than science. They tell us how to structure our thoughts and expressions, but not about the world itself.
That's a great way to put it. They provide the underlying structure for how we make sense of things, but they don't describe the content of our experiences. Logic ensures that our sentences are well-formed and consistent, while math gives us tools for calculation and measurement.
This is making me think about all the times in school when math felt like a completely separate world, detached from anything real. Maybe Wittgenstein was onto something there.
He certainly makes a compelling case, and it highlights how even something as seemingly objective as math is still shaped by the way we use language.
This whole discussion about the limits of language reminds me of another mind-boggling concept we mentioned earlier, solipsism. Can you remind us what that is and how it fits into Wittgenstein's framework?
Solipsism is the idea that only one's own mind is sure to exist. It's a philosophical rabbit hole that's both fascinating and frustrating. Wittgenstein, in his typical fashion, approaches it from a linguistic angle.
I'm all ears. How does language factor into solipsism?
Remember how we talked about the limits of language being the limits of my world? Well, solipsism, in a way, takes this idea to its extreme. If I can only talk about what I can experience, then it might seem like my world is the only world that exists. But here's the twist. Wittgenstein argues that this solipsistic viewpoint ultimately dissolves into realism.
Hold on, that seems paradoxical. How can solipsism, which is all about the individual mind, lead to realism, which emphasizes an objective world outside of ourselves?
That's the beauty of Wittgenstein's argument. He points out that the I at the center of solipsism isn't actually part of the world. It's the limit of the world. Think of it like the frame of a picture. The frame defines the boundaries of the picture, but it's not part of the picture itself.
So by recognizing the limits of my own perspective, I actually acknowledge that there's a world beyond those limits.
Exactly. By trying to define the world as my world, I inadvertently point to the existence of a world that's larger than myself. It's a fascinating example of how philosophical problems can sometimes be dissolved by examining the language we use to express them.
Okay, I think I'm starting to grasp that, even if it still feels a bit mind-bending. But there's one more big piece of the puzzle we haven't fully explored yet, the mystical. How does this idea of things that can't be expressed in language fit into everything we've discussed?
This is where the Tractatus gets really intriguing, and some might say controversial. Wittgenstein argues that there are indeed things that lie beyond the reach of language, things that can only be shown, not said.
Like what? Give us some concrete examples.
Well, he suggests that the very existence of the world, the fact that there is something rather than nothing, is a mystical proposition. We can't capture it in words because it's the ground of all facts.
So it's like asking, why is there something rather than nothing? That question itself seems to point towards something. That defies explanation.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And Wittgenstein also places ethics and aesthetics in this realm. He argues that questions of good and evil, beauty and ugliness, cannot be reduced to factual statements. We might be able to describe ethical actions or beautiful objects, but the essence of ethics and aesthetics themselves seems to elude language.
This all circles back to his famous quote, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent." It's like he's acknowledging the limits of our rational language-based understanding and pointing towards a deeper reality that we can't fully grasp with words.
You've hit the nail on the head, and it's this aspect of the Tractatus that continues to resonate with people, even if they don't agree with all of Wittgenstein's arguments. It leaves us with a sense of wonder and a recognition that there might be more to life than what we can capture in language. But there's one more crucial idea in the Tractatus we haven't discussed yet, and it might be the most provocative of them all.
Okay, I'm definitely intrigued. What is it?
It's the idea that the Tractatus itself is ultimately nonsensical.
Wait, what? He spends the entire book building this elaborate system of thought, drawing these precise distinctions between what can and can't be said. And then he claims it's all nonsense. How does that even make sense?
It's a bold move, and one that has puzzled philosophers for decades. Remember how Wittgenstein argues that language can only picture facts in the world? Well, he ultimately concludes that the Tractatus itself doesn't picture any facts. It's a series of propositions about language logic and the mystical, which he's already established as being beyond the realm of meaningful language.
So it's like he's using language to climb a ladder, and then once he reaches the top, he kicks the ladder away.
That's a great analogy. He's showing us the limits of language. By pushing language to its limits, he's essentially saying, I've shown you what can be said, but by saying it, I've also shown you that it shouldn't be said. He wants us to grasp the ideas, then transcend them by recognizing their inherent limitations.
It's like he's urging us to see the world not just through the lens of language, but also through a kind of direct experience that goes beyond words.
Exactly. He famously compares the Tractatus to a ladder that you use to climb up and then discard once you've reached a higher vantage point.
Wow. So the Tractatus is both a masterpiece of logical analysis and a self-proclaimed work of nonsense. That's a pretty powerful paradox.
And it's part of what makes the book so enduring. It leaves us with this profound sense of mystery and a recognition that some of the most important questions in life might not have answers that can be neatly packaged in words.
I have to admit, even though I'm still wrapping my head around some of the denser parts of the Tractatus, I'm feeling a strange sense of liberation. It's like Wittgenstein is giving us permission to think beyond the confines of language.
That's a wonderful way to put it, and I think that's a valuable takeaway for anyone who's ever felt frustrated by the limitations of words. There are truths that can only be grasped through experience and intuition, and a kind of quiet contemplation that goes beyond the chatter of our minds.
This has been an incredible deep dive. The Tractatus is definitely a challenging book, but it's also incredibly rewarding. It's a work that can stay with you long after you've finished reading it, prompting you to question your assumptions, to explore the boundaries of your own understanding, and to appreciate the mystery and wonder that lie at the heart of existence.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's a book that invites us to become more attentive to the nuances of language, to be more critical of our own thinking, and to be more open to the possibility that some of the most important things in life lie beyond the reach of words.
So for our listeners who might be feeling a bit overwhelmed by the Tractatus, what advice would you give them? How can they approach this book in a way that's both insightful and enjoyable?
First and foremost, I'd say don't be afraid to take it slowly. Don't expect to grasp everything on the first read. The Tractatus is a book that rewards patience and careful attention. Read passages multiple times, look up explanations and interpretations, and don't be afraid to discuss it with others.
It's like anything worthwhile, really. The more effort you put in, the more you get out of it.
Exactly. And remember, even Wittgenstein himself said that the point of philosophy is to show the fly the way out of the fly bottle. It's about untangling ourselves from the knots of our own thinking and finding a clearer, more expansive way of seeing the world.
That's a beautiful way to think about it. So if you're feeling trapped in a fly bottle of confusion, the Tractatus might just be the key to your liberation. It's a book that challenges us to think deeply, to question everything, and to embrace the mysteries that lie beyond the limits of language.
And who knows, you might even find yourself transformed by the experience.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. We hope you found it as thought-provoking as we have. Keep thinking, keep exploring, and we'll see you on our next deep dive.